All right, greetings everybody. I'm really glad to be hosting this conversation. I know that we've been having a few difficulties with Kimberly being able to join the conversation and have a chat to us. But just so that you know, this is a social audio experience, and what you're able to do is obviously raise your hand and let us know if you want to join the conversation, so that we can actually have this conversation about how to fly less. So, just by way of introduction to myself, I head up a consultancy called Future Work IQ, and we specialize in helping leadership teams get their heads around mega trends and how to adapt their businesses uh, as a result of those mega trends. At the moment, our focus is very heavily in helping leadership teams to improve the digital, or not the digital, the climate literacy that they have inside their organizations. Um, and obviously, because of the magnitude of the challenges we face, that is obviously, a very pertinent conversation that needs to be had at this time. And so we've been hosting a series of climate literacy conversations on LinkedIn. And, we've spoken, for example, of how to reduce emissions from corporate events. We've had a conversation around how to speak or start conversations around climate with colleagues and also with customers. And today's conversation is really about flying. So I'm hoping Kimberly has been able to sort out her issues related to how to reach us in the conversation. For everybody else in the room, just to say to you, if you could just give me an indication that you're hearing me properly, that's obviously quite important, because maybe the problem is on my side. I'm not entirely sure. But if you could just use the react buttons. Okay, so I see Nick and Derek and Anika and everybody has actually given me a signal that you can hear me fine. So that's really great. So just to give you a little bit of background regarding Prof Kimberly Nicholas, she is a sustainability scientist at Lund University in Sweden. She has published over 55 articles on climate and sustainability in leading peer-reviewed journals. She writes for publications such as Elle, The Guardian, Scientific American, New Scientist. She's the author of a book entitled Under the Sky We Make, How to Be Human in a Warming World. And she also creates a newsletter, a monthly newsletter entitled We Can Fix It. And actually, it's as a result of that newsletter that I reached out to Prof Kimberly to have a chat to us so that we can explore this topic about how to fly less. It was something that she mentioned in her last newsletter. In fact, there was the whole section on how to fly less, and yes, we can do that. So, Kimberly, just if I can go over to you, are you able to converse with us at the moment, or are you still having an issue with your sound? As mentioned, you are able to come into the room via a laptop or a mobile device. Okay, so Kimberly is having issues in trying to get connected to us via audio, so hopefully she can fix that. While we're waiting for that to happen, I see a couple of people that I know who have joined the conversation here. Kimberly, when you can speak to us, please do, so that I know that you are able to converse with us. But Dave, I would like you just to, if you can, just request to come up onto stage. I just want to hear a little bit about what is happening in Port Edward Island, where the cyclone, or not the cyclone, the hurricane has just been through. So if you raise your hand, I can let you onto the stage. There we go. All right. So let me allow you to speak while we're waiting for Kimberly to sort out herself. All right. There you go,
Hey,
Dave.
Peter, how are you?
I'm doing really great, thank you. And yourself?
Yeah, not bad. And this is funny because I didn't expect that you'd put me on the hot seat. I'm actually about to. I'm walking towards my generator outside to turn it on because we're still without power, and my daughter's inside coloring. She should be fine.
So,
But I'll give a quick update because I do have to go back inside.
yes, of course.
But yeah, no, it's been quite interesting. I mean, I guess the winds here were that of a hurricane or a two. They were very strong. Our island is kind of like a sandbar, and as also being partly a sandbar, the soil it's very rich, but it's also very I don't know what the word is for it. Like it's not dense, and so there's some really massive trees here that I guess are not really rooted in the ground as much as you'd think. And so there's just trees down absolutely everywhere. And it's a major issue for getting power restored, all these down trees. Um, they've gotten emergency services in from across the country and then even from the United States to help with this because, on the east coast of Canada, we also don't have the same amount of infrastructure when it comes to anything from healthcare through to construction or anything. Like we're just under service. So we've got emergency services coming through to help. But having seen some of the photographs of the beachfronts in some of the national parks that have protected dunes and just observing how much, I guess, I don't know if you call it erosion or what you call it, but these sand dunes are there to protect from erosion, and they also are there to enable really interesting kind of like wildlife and biophilia from for being able to sort of grow and prosper. And there's been massive devastation in those areas. And then anybody who had a cottage, near the ocean front, cottages are usually not, built to last kind of thing. Some of those cottages have literally been washed out to shore. Luckily, nobody seems to have died except for someone with an incident related actually to a generator, but related to the storm itself, nobody died. But you did make a comment, Peter, on a post I made yesterday showing what the island looked like before and after, and it seems like it hasn't been this bad since like 1930, a storm. And so, I mean, you're the expert on this. I don't know how much of what that before and after picture is normal and to be expected on an island that's kind of a sandbar rather than sort of bedrock. I really don't know what is normal and what is not normal, but it is definitely jarring and alarming. I'll say that.
Hi, everyone. I'm so sorry for the technical difficulties, but on the third device I tried, I'm now with you.
Great, Kimberly. I'm so excited to have you with us, and sorry for the technical glitch in getting you in, but you're here now, and that's great. So I just want to just say, Dave, thank you for filling in for us and giving us some information around the situation in Port Edward Island, and we know that that storm was very unusual for the Canadian Atlantic coast, and of course the science is telling us that as the planet heats up, we expect these kind of things to happen where hurricanes, etc., and typhoons or cyclones actually begin to move into different parts of the globe. But thank you very much. So, Kimberly, I'm going to begin my conversation with you by asking you to just tell us, and for those that may not know you, a little bit more about yourself. How long have you been at Lund University in Sweden, and what is your role there? And yeah, if you could just let us know, that'll be great.
Sure, and thank you for hosting me, Peter. So I'm a professor of sustainability science at Lund University in Sweden. I've been here for 12 years. Originally, I'm from California, and that's where I did my PhD work, which was about the impacts of climate change on the wine industry there. I come from a wine growing family in California. But for the last 12 years, I've been based here in Lund, and I research and teach in our Masters of Sustainability Science program. I see a couple of our students in the audience and alumni, so thank you for joining. My work now is really focused on helping people make decisions and take high impact climate action throughout their lives. And that's one of the topics I think we'll focus on today with how to fly less.
Great. So I wanted to just ask you from your perspective, Prof. Kimberly, why is this conversation that we need to have about basically looking at all our emission sources and seeing what we can do to decouple from fossil fuels, such an important conversation at the moment?
Well, what the science is telling us is that we are living in a rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. I actually got chills when I read those words. That comes from the summary from the UN Climate Panel, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, from their report that came out in February. And that's the situation we're in now, where we're in this very, very narrow window where we who are alive right now have a huge opportunity and responsibility to avert catastrophic climate change, to meet the Paris Agreement, and to limit warming as much as is humanly possible, because that will really be the difference between life and death for many people and places around the world. So that's what's at stake. That's why it matters. In order to stop warming, humans have to completely stop adding carbon pollution to the atmosphere. Warming will not stop until we do that. So in practice, that means we have to virtually eliminate all fossil fuels. So coal, oil, gas are history. They have a very limited, we need to be transitioning off of them as fast and fairly as we possibly can. And that's where flying comes into the mix, because in order to make this transition happen in the quickly narrowing window that we have, we basically need to do two things. We have to reduce overconsumption and make this transition to renewable energy. And in order to have enough clean energy to go around to meet everybody's needs, we have to increase efficiency and reduce consumption where it's excessive. And flying is kind of a classic example of that, because most people on Earth do not fly, have never flown, and it's just 1% of the global population who cause half of the emissions from flying. And flying causes about as much emissions as the country of Japan. So all emissions need to go to zero, and that includes flying. And unfortunately, unlike the majority of emissions today, flying is a case where we don't have ready to hand technical solutions that can eliminate emissions. For about 75% of today's emissions, we have the solutions that are ready. And basically, it's about producing clean energy and electrifying everything to run on that energy. And we just don't have a climate net zero way to fly right now. So demand actually has to go down.
Okay, so that's a really helpful description, and thank you for putting it so succinctly. So, I think what many people sometimes have a question about, and I think you've explained this quite well, that when you look at the transportation sector as a whole, in other words, road transport, that's passenger vehicles and then freight and shipping and rail, and obviously aviation fits into that whole puzzle. When you look at how much aviation emissions are, or the responsibility that aviation has for the emissions in the transport sector, I think our World in Data, I mean, there may be varying data on this, but they seem to show that it's about 11 or 12%, of the transportation thing. But I think what you said is the reason we need to focus on flying, and I just want to highlight this, and then I want to go into your experience and your newsletter, where you discuss this in a lot more detail. The reason we have to focus on this is because we've basically got to a stage where we've been pretty successful at being able to electrifying passenger transport and freight and rail, and to some extent shipping now, but aviation is the one that's lagging, and so we need to really give attention to what we can do to reduce that, right?
That's definitely part of the story, yes. I mean, as the number zero is really unforgiving, and that means that all emissions, all fossil fuels do need to be eliminated. All emissions from fossil fuels need to be eliminated. So we have to leave fossil fuels in the ground, stop producing and consuming them, stop burning them. And it's correct, the data that you mentioned, that planes are not the biggest source of emissions within the transport sector. And I also have projects and work on ways to reduce driving. A recent paper that we published looked at the 12 ways that have already worked to reduce cars in European cities, for example. But one reason that we need, so those are also necessary and important. But one reason we need to focus on flying less is, again, at the personal level, it's the highest impact action that someone who flies can take to reduce their personal carbon footprint.
Right.
And I think this is often, I'll try to illustrate this with an example. So many people have heard the statistic that if food waste were a country, it would be, somewhere in the top several countries in terms of emissions that it causes. And that's correct. Food waste causes a lot of emissions. However, that's at the global scale. When you look at the individual household scale, the emissions from food waste are pretty small. For example, you would save 4 times more emissions in your household by switching to a plant-based diet instead of eliminating food waste. So when we look at the personal footprint, for people who fly, flying is definitely the largest part of your personal carbon footprint, and followed by driving. So this is for those of us who are lucky and privileged enough to be in this top 10% globally. If you earn $38,000 a year or more, which is most people in countries like the US and Sweden do, we are in the global top 10% of the wealthiest people on earth, and we cause about half of household pollution from half of household climate pollution from our consumption. So that's why flying is really important, both as part of a cultural change to reduce overconsumption and as a high impact action for individuals who fly.
Right. Thank you so much. So just a good point before we get into your comments that you made in your newsletter. I just want to mention to everybody that's listening to us 2 things. LinkedIn hasn't yet got a automatic recording feature for this conversation on their LinkedIn audio system that they've developed. So what we're doing is we are recording this in another ways, just so that you are aware of that, for those of you that are in the audience. And then the second thing is, this is social audio. So, what we want you to do is, if you would like to come up and ask a question of Prof Kimberly, please do so. You can just raise your hand and I can allow you up onto the stage. Or if you want to make an observation, from your experience, you can also do so. So this is we're co-creating this conversation. I have a few things that I obviously want to ask Kimberly about her newsletter, etc., which really piqued my interest. But please understand that this is an experience that we are having together. So if you want to add to the conversation, you're more than welcome to raise your hand and I will get you up. So, Kimberly, you mentioned in your newsletter, this one that I read in Connect, where I came across this whole discussion that you had about flying less. You spoke about a realization that you had personally at a conference in 2012. Do you want to just talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So my flying wake-up moment happened over a beer that I was having with my friend Charlie at a climate conference in Vienna 10 years ago now. And Charlie had taken the train to this meeting from the UK, and I had flown from Copenhagen. So we lived about an equal distance from the meeting, but I had taken a flight and he had taken a train. And I knew, being a climate scientist, I knew theoretically and analytically that flying was my biggest source of climate pollution. But I just had been avoiding that fact for a long time. I am a former frequent flyer. In 2010, I actually took 15 round trip flights. So I definitely was in this group of the 1% of frequent flyers in the world who cause half of climate pollution from flying, who are the ones who most need to reduce our flying. But I had just not wanted to confront that fact, and especially because I had taken a job in Sweden and my parents and many of my closest friends still live in California. So I have this really long distance. It's not impossible to get between those 2 places without flying, but it's a lot more difficult and it takes a lot of time. So in my mind, I wasn't willing to give up flying because of this one flight. It's what George Monbiot calls love miles, having loved ones really far away. And therefore, I just wasn't willing to think about it any further. But finally, I had spent, a long day in this windowless room with a barrage of depressing PowerPoints. Even 10 years ago in 2012, the evidence was really clear that the impacts of climate change were here and now. They were bad. They are going to get worse until we stop burning fossil fuels. And I just couldn't escape that feeling anymore. I was struck by this realization looking around the room that I had flown there, causing a lot of global warming with my climate pollution. Most of my fellow scientists in this room had also flown there. And I just had this feeling of, like I was a doctor at a conference of doctors where we're puffing on cigarettes and telling our patients to quit smoking. I just couldn't escape this cognitive dissonance anymore. So over a beer or maybe two with Charlie, we had this discussion, and what he had done was he stopped flying within Europe. And he said, you know what, it's doable. And we talked about people who had inspired us to do this, and we knew the data, but I think it was really that conversation where I heard about it in really practical terms, like, okay, how do you manage to be part of European collaborative projects, which is something I was doing at the time? How do you, build your career as an early stage academic at that time? How do you get your name out there and give talks and do the things that are expected of us in our profession? And I became convinced that actually this is something I could do. And it led to a lot of unexpected things. One thing, that benefit I hadn't really foreseen, I hadn't realized how much time and energy I was spending on this cognitive dissonance of flying. And I mean, I even had spreadsheets for a couple of years before then. I had been thinking about, should I be flying less? And I was making spreadsheets and trying to get the data and calculate, what's my time, money, and carbon impact if I fly versus take a train for this and that trip. It was just exhausting. It didn't really give me any useful information on which to base my decision. So I found it was much simpler for me to choose to follow this rule or this limit that I set for myself. And it actually led to a lot of creativity and adventure and even romance when my now husband, on our fourth date, we went on a 15-hour train trip to Paris together. And I kind of thought, this is never going to work. This is like a big risk. We're not going to like each other anymore at the end of this trip. But actually, we liked each other better. So I can recommend train travel and slow travel as a really good filter for identifying people who you really enjoy spending time with and would like to have as a bigger part of your life.
Kimberly, something you said in telling your experience about what you saw or what you experienced in 2012 is got Mohammed to raise his hand. So Mohammed, welcome up. Your question or comment at this point? Remember just to unmute. Okay. All right. So I'm sure we'll get him to be able to unmute before. I know he's used LinkedIn audio before, so that's not a problem. So talking about flying, Kimberly, basically in your newsletter, and I mean, if you think about this logically, that this is really the reason. I mean, there are two main reasons why people get into an aircraft to fly. One is personal. In other words, I assume, something like going on a vacation or like you mentioned, visiting family. Let's talk a little bit about that. So in your newsletter, you covered what kind of thinking can go into making personal flying less. I know you did mention a few things, but is there anything else in particular that you think is worth exploring?
Well, one way to get started maybe is, first to recognize that it's not everyone who flies. As I mentioned, it's this global 1% who do half the flying. Even within countries like the US and UK, the majority of people at pre-COVID, when we have data that wasn't affected by the pandemic, the majority of people didn't fly, hadn't taken a flight in the previous year. And it's really a small number who have taken 2 or more flights per year. So I guess it's especially that group, which I myself was in, and maybe some of the listeners are in now, who really need to be the ones who focus on reducing our flying. And I guess a place to start is to look at, maybe the simplest place is to say, which flights are unnecessary? There was a study by a Lund colleague of mine, Stefan Gosling, that found that almost half of the frequent flyers for the survey that he conducted said that their flight wasn't necessary, their trip rather, wasn't really important or necessary. So those are real easy, low-hanging fruit to eliminate unnecessary trips that you can right off the bat say, you know what, I really don't need to be there. I could do this virtually. I could do this in another way. For most people, about 80% in Sweden, where I have the data handy, most flights are for personal reasons, so for holidays. So that's another one, and there's a campaign called Flight Free that started here in Sweden and has spread to many countries around the world. They encourage people in the UK, for example, to pledge to take a flight-free year. You can also pledge to take a flight-free year for holidays. So if you're obligated for work or for other commitments that you can't pledge not to fly, you could pledge not to fly for holidays. And I think that's quite an easy, and again, creative potentially, or can unlock some creativity in thinking about, okay, what are the things I care about and need and want from a holiday? Maybe I want to spend time with family or loved ones in a beautiful place. Well, there certainly are options for that close to where we all live that could meet that criteria. And one, again, small example from a website that I linked to in my newsletter that's about low carbon travel. I discovered this previous air hangar for like airships outside of Berlin that has been converted to a tropical indoor beach. So I took my husband there on a train trip several years ago. And, we had this tropical beach vacation in the middle of Germany with umbrella drinks and, lying on the beach reading a novel. And it was lovely and a bit bizarre, but like really fun and enjoyable. So, I mean, there are a lot of ways you can kind of meet the needs of adventure and travel and relaxation and renewal without having to fly. And you can be quite creative in figuring out what those look like. I mean, low carbon and active travel. I have a student who's built a raft himself and rafted through Denmark. That was certainly a big adventure. And he has amazing photos and stories from his adventure close to home.
So I want to ask you, just in your opinion, the experience we had with COVID, and obviously the lockdowns that were associated with that. There are obviously some powerful lessons that came out of that experience now that we're moving forward, right? And things like, for example, being able to cut out flights that really aren't necessary. So in your view, like let me give you my example. So I live in South Africa, and my daughter is currently at university in London, and we don't see each other that often. In fact, during the COVID pandemic, it was a 3-year gap that we had in seeing each other, where prior to that we were seeing each other at least twice a year, sometimes 3. So in a situation like that, I know in your newsletter you make this. By the way, I've just copied a link to Kimberly's newsletter in the comments. So for those of you that are listening to this, you can actually go and click on that link, and you'll be able to see, kind of what we're talking about. But in a scenario like that, what would you recommend for families, if at all possible? I mean, what kind of conversations should families have when it comes to that kind of travel?
Excuse me. Yeah, great question. I'm in a similar position where my parents are quite far away. And similarly, it was, it really made you stop and think. And it was not, you can't take for granted the ability to see your loved ones who are far away during the pandemic. I think, to put it, like reflecting from my own experience, when I was finishing graduate school and applying for professor jobs, I applied for 66 jobs over 3 years. And I was really all over the world, but primarily in the US is where most of the jobs were at that time that I was looking at. The job that I ended up getting and that I really am happy with is here in Sweden. But because there's an ocean between me and my family, I think if I were thinking about the climate crisis in the way I am now, back in 2010, I actually wouldn't have applied for this job. I wouldn't have put myself in a position where I would be locked into high carbon transport or, months a year spent traveling to see my family if I don't want to fly. Right. Is just not fundamentally unsustainable. And I can't build a time machine and go back, and I'm navigating the dilemma that I am in now. But I think kind of it does boil down to, we have to figure out ways to have exchange and opportunities and build relationships and appreciate new places and cultures, and also recognize that it's never going to be sustainable to live so far away from a place where you have deep ties and are going to want to travel physically.
Right. Okay. So you know, what I begin to sense happening with a lot of people, and I mean, you had this conversation with yourself in 2012 at this conference, and you know, even now when you think about where your parents are and where you situated, you look back and you say, I would have made different choices. I think what's beginning to happen is the reality of what we face, especially after the summer that we had in the northern hemisphere, with the heat waves spanning across basically the whole of the northern hemisphere. People are suddenly beginning to take this conversation a lot more seriously because they're beginning to understand that, listen, this is the trajectory we're on, and we are going to be eventually, and this is what we say to leadership teams, by the way, you know, eventually you may be forced to act differently. And before you get to that point, the course of wisdom is to reinvent your situation so that you know you're not as disrupted when a situation arrives eventually, when the regulations or whatever we need to do becomes so urgent that there are certain things that you just can't do. Now,
Mm-hmm.
I want to ask you, you know, obviously the other sector of this is business travel. So that to me, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but that to me is almost easier to stop. I don't know. What is your feeling on that? What you know, concepts and things should business people think about when they think about business travel?
I think so too. I do think it's easier to stop or greatly reduce business travel than these love miles, which are kind of the hardest category that we've been talking about. I think a good way to think about that, I mean, there are many examples from the pandemic. World Resources Institute has a helpful guide. I mean, they found that they reduced their flying more than 95, I think close to 95, more than 90% in the pandemic, as did many other organizations. And that reflects the global data. I mean, aviation was the sector that reduced its emissions the most in percentage terms during the pandemic. So flying, you know, really almost came to a standstill for a while there.
Right.
That didn't do, because other sectors cause more emissions in total, emission savings were greater from other changes, but flying was really, really dramatic. I mean, more than 90% reduction at some stages of the pandemic. So we know that it's possible. I think we've learned, you know, what does and doesn't work. I worry that we haven't taken those lessons to heart. And I mean, unless those changes are supported and institutionalized and built into our culture and infrastructure of work, they won't persist on their own. So, I mean, we need to be sure that we follow best practices in hosting virtual events, for example, in including people virtually, in making events work just practically and logistically with technology. I mean, you know, everyone has Zoom now, but there is etiquette to hosting online, for example, to making sure you're including people. The tech snafu that I had today, which I apologize for again, I mean, it shows that we do have to be fluid with different platforms and, you know, be prepared for the tech like learning curve on new platforms,
Yeah.
and not give up when we encounter those, and make sure that we actually, you know, have resources to deal with them. So that's one thing. I guess another thing is a real leader in this space has been the Tyndall Center for Climate Change. So they're a research group in Norwich in the UK. And they have a guide from, I think it's 2015, called Creating a Low Carbon Research Culture. And there are a lot of really helpful kind of tools and frameworks in that guide. And one of them is a decision chart for when to fly and what trips to prioritize that are aligned with their mission. So, for example, they say if their researchers are participating in an international assessment that has really high policy relevance, like the IPCC, those flights would be more justified than others. Younger and earlier career researchers and those from the global south are given priority in flying. And I think from a justice perspective, that makes a lot of sense. And those are conversations we should be having about, you know, the data showed just the opposite, that it tends to be the older and more senior and established professors who do the most flying, while earlier careers are often more willing to reduce their flying. So that's a fundamental imbalance, and I would say a justice question that we should be, discussing and finding ways to grapple with. And that's something our university is talking about right now, because flying is a major source of emissions at universities. A UBC study found flying is about 2/3 of, again, as many emissions as all on-campus emissions combined. And most flying is done by a few, super flyers, basically. So how do you get the people who take multiple flights a year to reduce, and how do you distribute the flights fairly among especially those who haven't had the chance to fly or from disadvantaged backgrounds, earlier career folks? Those are the priorities we should be making if we're doing any flying. So I think these are conversations that need to be happening, basically in every business, in every context and setting.
Okay, that's I want to ask you something, but before I do, I just want to mention to everybody that's listening, this is a social audio experience. If you have a question or an observation that you would like to make, please just raise your hand, and I can get you to pop onto the stage, and we can hear what your question is, and Prof Kimberly could possibly give her insights on that. But this is what this is about. It's a social audio experience. So if you do feel inclined to do that, just raise your hand, and I'll get you up onto stage so that you can be part of the conversation. I wanted to just ask you on something else. Just reminded me of what you said now. The war in Ukraine, basically the knock-on effect of that was the energy crisis that's being experienced in Europe at the moment. And I saw that the International Energy Agency, just a month or two ago, they had a campaign about what you could do to reduce your usage of energy. I think it was a 10-point plan or a 9-point plan. I can't remember exactly what it was, but in that they included things like, for example, not driving your car on a Sunday, reducing your speed limit on a freeway. They gave the recommendation to employers to allow people to work from home for 3 days a week. And that specific scenario, they said that if the third of the workforce that can work like that were able to do that 3 days a week without commuting, they would end, or it would result in not burning about 500,000 barrels of oil. But in that conversation, they also had a recommendation about taking the train instead of the plane. My question to you is, as we, and by the way, just before we came onto this conversation, there was a workshop that the International Energy Agency hosted just this morning on energy efficiency and how to change behavior of people, etc. It's available on YouTube. If you go there now, you can actually see the conversation that was had there, perspectives from different parts of the world. But my question to you is, Kimberly, just in your thinking, as we go from where we are, 2020, 25, 2030, how do you see what will happen as far as regulation and all those kind of things are concerned in trying to actually curb emissions? What is your take on that?
I think it's really important that two things. I mean, one, that high emitters do change our behavior, reduce overconsumption, lead by example. It's important that we include that, caveat of high emitters, because it's not everyone who needs to change behavior. Right. Close to, the majority of the world today actually has pretty close to sustainable emissions. So when you look on a per capita basis, so their individual behavior change is not so necessary, as is more system change of supplying clean energy and mobility and food that's produced in a way that doesn't destroy nature and produce a lot of greenhouse gases, etc. But for those of us who are flying, we're kind of automatically in this category of this top 10% who do need to look at our own behavior. And secondly, we need government policies. There was I haven't seen the IEA study that you were just mentioning, but there was a study in June in Nature by Felix Kritzig, an IPCC author, that laid out 10 policies that governments should adopt to slash reliance on fossil fuels, particularly Russian fossil fuels, but that could really substantially start to speed up the transition away from fossil fuels, protect economies. And there he focused on buildings, transport, and food. And within transport, exactly as you're saying, it was limiting driving, so banning cars from inner cities, which I mentioned we have another study about, and I wrote about that in my We Can Fix It newsletter a couple months ago. Telecommuting, as you mentioned as well, and restricting flying. And in his case, he focused on banning short haul flights because those are the easiest to replace with other modes, and especially on conferences, which tend to be a really big source of emissions in academia and in many other fields. So going to virtual conferences or remote hybrid regional hub conferences and every other year conferences, citing conferences in a central location. So, if you're having a European conference, hosting it in Brussels or Amsterdam, which is pretty accessible by train from a lot of different areas, as opposed to, the Canary Islands or something that might appeal to, from a holiday perspective, but be quite difficult to get to for many people without flying.
I want to say to you, Kimberly, thank you very much for firstly taking the time to have a chat about this topic. I think it's a very important one for everybody. I've actually left the link to what sparked this conversation in the comments section on the event. You'll actually see the link to Prof Kimberly's newsletter there. Can I ask you, perhaps in parting, and by the way, just to mention to everybody again that this is social audio. You can raise your hand and come up on stage and make a comment if you want to, or ask a question. I want to ask you, perhaps in closing, Kimberly, if you had to be in front of a leadership team of any organization, whether that be a university or a private enterprise, what would your key message be to leadership teams at this juncture where we are at the moment in 2020? What would you, if you could wave a wand, what would you want everybody to walk out of a room like that with in their minds?
I really want everyone to feel two things, which is a sense of urgency for how critical the climate crisis is. And secondly, a sense of agency, meaning we do have abilities and possibilities and responsibilities to make meaningful, high impact changes. So, what those changes are depends on who and where you are. But if we're talking about business leadership, there's so much that can be done in the professional sphere. Project Drawdown has a great guide to climate action at work. There's one called Climate Solutions at Work, which is a PDF, and they've just made some infographics that I retweeted yesterday, so you can look for those as well, that are basically saying, okay, how do you make every job a climate job in practice? What does that actually look like? How do you make human resources and procurement a climate job? What are the main things on your table? So I think that have a big climate impact. I think contributing to this fast and fair transition to a fossil-free world as core to your business, whatever your business is, both because it's the right thing to do and because really business depends on this. I mean, we will not have a stable economy and a prosperous economy if we don't have a stable climate. It's just not possible. The climate is so fundamental to everything that we do, of what crops can grow where, who can live where. These are just basic prerequisites to having a good life for people on Earth. So it is business's concern. And I think, I have some more concrete guidance depending on what industry you're in, but basically a really good place to start is science-based targets. That's a really rigorous initiative to get businesses to do their fair share of meeting the Paris Agreement. And I think following those practices that are set out will help people measure their emissions, understand where their emissions come from, reduce the emissions that are within your direct control, and also work within your industry and suppliers and the bigger picture to reduce the emissions that are outside of your direct control, because those also play a big role. And it's by starting to really engage and starting to demand from suppliers along supply chains and really making it possible to make these big scale decarbonization happen that we're going to see the speed and scale of climate action that we need.
Thank you. We can see why you are an expert in this field. That was a great comment. Thank you. Nuela, I know you've asked to pop up to ask a question or make an observation. If you could just unmute yourself and have a chat to us, depending on what. Oh, there we go.
Okay, it's really a pleasure coming into this platform, ma'am. And I must say that I've learned quite a lot. Now, I've got a question to ask, and with your permission, I would like uh, Kimberly Nicholas, ma'am, for you to, have a say in that. So here goes my question. On the basis of stresses of flight, most people usually complain of having jet lag here and there. So, what would be your take on that as regards to how to fly less?
Well, thank you for that question and thanks for joining. Another benefit of slower travel is lack of jet lag. If you're cycling or taking the train somewhere, or going, a short distance from home where you're not changing time zones, you're not going to experience jet lag because you're basically traveling at a pace that the human body is designed and evolved to accommodate and handle, and things make sense to you. One of my favorite things about traveling by train in Europe, so I live in Sweden at the north of Europe, and if I take a train south, for example, to Paris, you really see how the seasons change by distance and not just by time. So, if I'm this time of year, now it's really fall here where I am, the leaves are changing color and it's very beautiful. But if I were to travel south, I might see that, oh, it doesn't feel like fall yet. Fall hasn't arrived. And the opposite in the spring, where it might still be cold and snow on the ground here. And in March, maybe daffodils are coming up in Paris where they're not even thinking about it here yet. So I think you do see that from the window of a train, but you experience it in a pace that your body, I think, can more easily adapt to. So a lack of jet lag is also a benefit of a flying less future.
Great, thank you. I see we have, is it Audi?
Okay, thank you so much. Would you mind if I ask just one more question?
Please go ahead, Nuela.
Sure, it's fine with me.
Okay, so we all know that basically the aviation sector gives us a huge a huge advantage over every other means of transportation. So looking at it, like security wise, we all can believe quite sure that in the aspect of security, it is one of the safest means of transportation. So, how would you probably get to convince more people into, like flying less and then taking other means of transportation as a prior option?
Safety is another really important benefit, and I think that ties in with a lot of work that's being done now to demonstrate the dangers actually of cars. Cars are actually the leading killer of children in both the US and in Europe. And fossil fuel pollution kills millions of people worldwide, where cars in cities and elsewhere are a major source of that air pollution. So I think redesigning mobility in general, more broadly than just flying less, which we've been talking about today, but having places where we live that are close to everything we need for work and entertainment and education and recreation, for shopping and food and so on, having our needs close to hand and reducing the need for mobility in the first place is this first step of this avoid, shift, improve framework that's really essential for making big, meaningful emissions reductions happen. So too often, I think the conversation is focused on the end of the pipeline of, improving existing technologies like switching fossil cars to electric cars. And that's necessary, but it's not sufficient. You actually need to look more deeply at the root causes of the problems and see, okay, how can we make places that are accessible and equitable and inviting and safe and delightful for everyone? And how do we make it so that people actually don't need much mobility to access those places? Then, go down this hierarchy of how can we make mobility that is there sustainable? How do we make it active, walking or biking or wheeling or public transit? And then finally, for the cars that do remain, for those who really need them, how do we make those as clean as possible? But I think, inherently, cars are going to be a less safe form of transport than other forms of transport. And we need to have more fundamental redesign.
Thank you, Kimberly. Audie, if you could unmute yourself and ask your question or comment.
And Peter, we'll have to make this the last one, I think.
Yes, we will.
Hey, I hope you can hear me well. I'm going to be the last. Just wanted to say thank you to both of you and Nuela and all the people listening. It's been pretty interesting. I joined a bit late. I'm going to make it short as we run out of time. I just wanted to share a couple of thoughts. So no question. Kimberly, I wanted to let you know I am based in Sweden and I have traveled with night trains and all around the Nordic countries. And one input I want to bring to the table is also that traveling with trains is a way to connect with people way more than when you're flying. And it might sound a bit secondary, but I think it's such a beautiful benefit that you get from this journey that in itself is a travel and it can be enjoyable. And I think it's when we talk about climate change and system change, we also want to bring, I think, hopefully a stronger sense of community and living together. And I think that this could also happen through public transportation. Now, the last participant also had a great point when it comes to safety. So my company is coming to the COP27 and there has been some worries for women to go with a train to Egypt, which I totally understand. And I think at the end of the day, this is also something that governments need to really take action on and make it the safest as possible when it comes to public transportation. Also make it accessible is extremely important. I think Austria and Germany and maybe Switzerland already made what we call the climate ticket. And I can only but hope that it could be a European initiative because Europe has everything, on hand and available to make it easy and fast and safe and fun. So that was my inputs and super nice to join you. And thank you again.
Thanks,
thank you. What lovely comments. And that's a really good note to end on.
Kimberly, I just want to say to you and Audie also for your comments. Thank you for sharing your experience. And you're quite right. This is about a community, which is what these social audio events are all about. The more we talk about this, the more we tackle the challenges that we have. Kimberly, I just want to ask you one final question. I know people can connect to your work via your newsletters. They can obviously subscribe to that and they can obviously follow you here on LinkedIn. But where would you say are you the most active on social media so that people can follow the work you do and the insights that you share?
I think if you want to get the deeper dives and not too overwhelmed, the newsletter is the best place, and that's over at wecanfixit.substack.com. I also try to post the newsletter here on LinkedIn, but I have to admit I'm behind on that, and it's a little bit of a logistical difficulty for me. So that's the safest place to find me. I've been probably I'm the most active social media wise over on Twitter, and I'm KA_Nicholas over there. So would be very happy, and I'm getting more involved here in LinkedIn, and this was my first LinkedIn audio. I think that was obvious because I had those technical difficulties at the beginning, but I really enjoyed the format. I really enjoyed the conversation. So thank you, Peter, for introducing me to this format and for your patience and for the conversation.
No worries at all. And thank you for being willing to take the time out of your busy schedule to come and talk to us about this very important topic about how we can fly less. So we're going to keep hosting these social audio events around this theme of climate literacy. So you can follow myself here and just to be updated with that. Our next big conversation that we're going to have is with a scientist that works primarily with the data coming out of Greenland. And that is going to be another fascinating conversation because there's some very powerful business lessons in there as well. But until next time, thank you very much, Kimberly. Thank you, everybody, for listening. And for those that were able to come up onto stage and ask, we really appreciate your participation. And we will all chat again soon. Have a good Wednesday.